Felicity Hale had spent 2 years learning how to disappear, because invisible women don't get hurt, and a widow with no family and a dead husband's medical debt couldn't afford to be seen. She washed the floors of the Lombardi mansion on Staten Island, folded the silk shirts of a man whose name people whispered like a prayer, or a warning, and loved a 3-year-old boy who wasn't hers, as if he were the only thing keeping her heart beating. Toby Lombardi ran the Red Hook waterfront the way his uncle had taught him, with a cold hand and colder eyes, a 36-year-old king of a kingdom built on fear, a widower who'd never figured out how to hold his own son without feeling like he might break him, and his fiancée, Sable Voss, was perfect, always saying the exact right thing with a smile that never quite reached her eyes, 6 weeks from becoming the woman who'd run that house and everyone in it. Then one quiet afternoon, a sound tore through the marble halls, the wet, terrible thud of a body falling, and when Toby reached the top of his grand staircase, he found his sister Delphine crumpled at the bottom, her cane 3 steps above her, and Sable standing there with one hand pressed over her mouth, whispering that it was an accident, that Delphine had simply lost her footing. Delphine opened her eyes long enough to say 4 words, "I didn't slip," and then she was gone into the dark. Everyone in that house knew their job was to nod and stay silent, and Felicity knew it better than anyone. Because the wrong word in a house like this didn't cost you your job, it cost you everything. But she also knew something nobody else did. Little Walter had been sitting in the upstairs hallway with his wooden blocks, and that boy had seen it all, and he couldn't lie, didn't even know yet why telling the truth was something most people learned to be afraid of. What that child said next would put a target on a maid's back, turn an accusation around until Felicity herself stood accused of pushing a mafia boss's sister down those stairs, and force a man who trusted no one to decide whether the clearest pair of eyes in his whole brutal world belonged to his own 3-year-old son. If this is the kind of story that keeps you up at night, hit that like button right now, share it with someone who loves a twist they never saw coming, and subscribe so you never miss what happens next. So now let's go back to that quiet afternoon, just before the scream, when everything in the Lombardi house was still pretending to be fine. The ambulance arrived after 11 minutes, and in those 11 minutes, Toby Lombardi lived through years. He knelt beside his sister on the cold marble floor, one hand supporting her head, the other holding the hand that was slowly going cold, and for the first time in a life everyone believed had never known fear, he found himself shaking. The servants stood pressed back into the dark corners, and no one dared breathe too loudly. When the paramedics lifted Delphine onto the stretcher, he followed close beside her, not leaving her by even half a step, and when Sable started to follow, he said only one sentence, his voice hoarse and low, telling her to stay and watch the house, and no one in the room understood that it was the first time he didn't want her near him. At the hospital on Staten Island, he sat in the painfully bright white corridor for 3 hours, both elbows braced on his knees, both hands clasped together, as though he were praying for something he had never believed in. The doctor came out close to midnight, tired but not hopeless, and said Delphine was lucky, that despite severe fractures to her wrist and hip, and a mild concussion, there was no internal bleeding, nothing life-threatening, and with time she would recover completely. Toby nodded, thanked him in a flat, emotionless voice, and only when the doctor had disappeared from sight did he allow himself to close his eyes for 1 second and release the breath he had been holding since late afternoon. They moved Delphine into a quiet private room, and he pulled a chair close to the bed, sat down, and went nowhere else. He stayed awake all that night. He watched his sister's chest rise and fall faintly beneath the thin blanket, watched the purple bruise spreading across her temple, watched the casted arm lying across her stomach, and in the stillness of the hospital room, those 4 words kept returning again and again inside his head like a rhythm that refused to stop. I did not slip. She had said it in a weak voice, but one so clear it chilled him, her half-open eyes searching for his face, confused, hurting, but certain in a way that he understood too well, because Delphine had never said anything she did not truly believe. Then she had slipped out of consciousness, and now she lay here, knowing nothing more, leaving him alone with that sentence suspended between him and everything he had ever thought was true. He wanted to believe it had been the impact, that his sister had been confused by the concussion, that people said meaningless things when their heads had just struck stone. He wanted so badly to believe that. But there was something inside him, the thing that had kept him alive all those years in a world where trust was a luxury that could get a man killed, and that thing would not let him believe. Back at the house, while the master of the house kept vigil beside the hospital bed, Felicity carried Walter back to the little boy's room at the end of the second-floor hallway. The child did not cry, and it was that silence that frightened her most. A 3-year-old child should have fussed, should have asked for a story, should have asked why the house had been so noisy. But Walter only clung tightly to the front of her shirt, his tiny fingers gripping so hard, the knuckles turned white. And he kept shifting uneasily even after she had laid him in bed, pulled the blanket up, and sat down beside him. She sang softly to him, an old lullaby her own mother had once sung, and stroked the boy's soft hair with her calloused hand, her heart twisting with a fear she could not yet name. The boy stared up at the ceiling with wide-open eyes, not sleepy at all, and once his lips moved as if he meant to say something, but then he stopped, turned, and buried his face against her shoulder, and she could feel that small chest beating faster than usual. She didn't know what he had seen. She only knew that this child, the child she loved more than her own life, was not the same tonight as he was on other nights. She sat with him until his breathing finally grew even, until those tightly clenched fingers loosened in sleep, and even then she still did not dare stand up. Outside the window, the sky began to shift from black into the pale, washed-out gray of early morning. Toby returned to the mansion just as dawn was breaking, his body aching, his eyes burning from lack of sleep. He stepped into the grand foyer, and his feet stopped on their own at the foot of the staircase. He stood there for a long time, looking up at each white marble step leading to the upper floor, at the landing where his sister had fallen, at the cold wrought iron railing, and for the first time, he did not see it as part of his home. He saw it as a crime scene. Morning came with the smell of coffee and a strangely calm sense of order, as though the house were trying to convince itself that last night had only been a nightmare already past. Sabel Voss came down to the kitchen right on time, her hair pinned neatly, wearing a soft cream sweater that made her look both gentle and composed, and she began telling the story, not hurriedly, not defensively, but in the quiet voice of a woman carrying the sorrow of the whole family on her shoulders. She told the housekeeper, told the cook, told the 2 gardeners who had just come on shift, and each time she told it, the story became a little more complete, a little smoother, until it was no longer an account of what had happened, but a truth already framed and ready to be believed. She said that Delphine had absolutely refused to use the elevator that afternoon, that she had always been stubborn that way. Everyone in the house knew it, that Toby had begged his sister so many times to have another handrail installed along the stairs after she sprained her ankle the week before, but she had brushed him off and said she wasn't old enough to need something to cling to. She said she had been walking right behind Delphine, that she had seen the tip of the cane slip off the edge of the marble step, had seen Delphine pitch forward, that she had lunged out and tried to catch her arm but had only grabbed empty air, and that she would never forget that helpless feeling for the rest of her life. When she reached that part, she lightly raised a hand to dab at the corner of her eye, and the entire kitchen seemed to sink into a silence full of sympathy. The servants nodded. They always nodded. That was their duty, what they were paid to do, and in a house like the Lombardi house, nodding and keeping quiet were survival skills more important than anything else. Felicity stood in the corner of the kitchen, still drying the glasses, and she nodded like everyone else, but inside her, something was beginning to freeze, because she knew one thing no one else in that kitchen knew, and every smooth word that slipped from Sabel's mouth felt like another piece of ice being dropped into her chest. Toby walked in at that moment, still wearing the clothes from the night before, his face marked by the exhaustion of a man who hadn't slept at all. Sabel immediately abandoned the story, stepped toward him, laid one hand on his arm, and asked about Delphine in a voice full of concern, and he answered briefly that his sister would be all right, that she was resting. Then Sabel told him the story again, this time more slowly, more gently, the whole version she had polished throughout the morning, about Delphine's stubbornness, about the cane, about the edge of the marble step, about the moment when she had not reached her in time. Toby listened. He stood still, holding a cup of coffee he had not yet tasted, and he nodded in the right places, said he understood, said it wasn't her fault. But while his mouth spoke those words, Those 4 words echoed again inside his head, cold and clear. I did not slip. And he sensed a gap as thin as a strand of hair between the story being told in front of him and the sentence his sister had whispered before she lost consciousness. He said nothing about that gap. He only took a sip of coffee that had already gone cold and let it sit quietly inside him. At that exact moment, Walter came toddling into the kitchen, barefoot on the cold tile floor, and Sable bent down and opened her arms to welcome him with a radiant smile, calling his name in that sweet voice she always used whenever Toby was there. But Walter did not run to her. The little boy curved around those outstretched hands, crossed the entire kitchen, and threw himself against Felicity's legs, wrapping his arms tightly around her calf and hiding his face in the folds of her skirt, as though he were seeking the only shelter he knew. Felicity set the glass down, instinctively bent, and lifted him into her arms, and the boy immediately wrapped his arms around her neck and pressed his cheek against her shoulder. For a moment, the smile on Sable's lips hardened. Her outstretched hands slowly lowered, and something passed through the bottom of her eyes, so quickly almost no one could have caught it, something that looked partly like hurt and partly like something far colder. She forced a smile, joked that the boy was very attached to the maid today, and turned to pour Toby more coffee as though there were nothing worth noticing. But Felicity, standing there with the child in her arms, had caught that look, and she held Walter just a little tighter. That evening, when the whole house had sunk into the heavy quiet that often followed terrible days, Felicity was in the laundry room at the end of the ground floor hallway, folding stacks of towels still warm from the dryer, while Walter sat on the floor beside her feet, playing with the wooden blocks he carried everywhere, like little friends he never left behind. She liked these hours, that quiet pocket at the end of the day, when there was only her and the boy, when the steady hum of the dryer filled the space, and she could pretend the world outside this small room did not exist. But tonight, the boy wasn't playing. He kept stacking one wooden block, then knocking it down, stacking it again, then knocking it down again, and finally he stood, came to her side, and tugged lightly at her sleeve in the way she had learned meant something serious. She set down the towel she was folding, crouched so she was level with his eyes, and asked him what he wanted. The boy looked at her with his wide brown eyes, his face carrying a solemnity far too grave for a 3-year-old child, that seriousness children sometimes have when they know they are saying something important, but do not yet understand why it matters. Then, in his small, clear child's voice, he told her what he had seen in the second-floor hallway the afternoon before. He told her about the pretty lady with the sparkling ring, about what the lady had done with her foot to Miss Delphine's cane right before Miss Delphine fell, and about how afterward the lady had covered her mouth and acted like she was crying, even though there hadn't been any tears at all. Felicity went still. She felt as though all the blood in her body had dropped away, her hands resting on her knees suddenly going ice cold, and for one long moment she could not breathe. She asked the boy to say it again, trying to keep her voice normal, trying to smile so he would not see that she was trembling, and Walter repeated it, every detail exactly the same as the first time, not adding a word, not leaving a word out, the way a child speaks before he knows how to decorate or exaggerate, simply reporting what his eyes had recorded. She asked him a third time, this time more softly, almost in a whisper, and he still answered the same way, patient, certain, then turned back to his wooden blocks, as though he had just finished telling her something ordinary, as though he had just said the neighbor's cat had come through the yard today. Felicity sank down onto the floor, her back against the washing machine as it vibrated faintly, and pulled the boy into her lap, holding him very tightly, not to comfort him, but to keep herself from breaking apart. Because she understood in that very moment that what she had just heard was not a child's story. This child was not the son of some nameless servant. Walter was Toby Lombardi's own son, the flesh and blood of the most powerful man she had ever stood near, and what the boy had just told her was not an accusation against a stranger, but an accusation against the woman who was about to become his stepmother, about to become the mistress of this house, about to hold power over life and death for every servant in it, including Felicity herself. The fear rising inside her was unlike any fear she had ever known. It wasn't fear of losing her job, though losing her job would mean losing everything. It was a deeper fear, a darker fear, the fear of someone who had accidentally picked up something she never should have touched, a secret so heavy that simply knowing it was already dangerous. She thought about the whispers she had once half heard among the older servants, about names no one mentioned anymore, about people who had once worked in houses like this and then one day quietly disappeared. She pressed her cheek to Walter's soft hair, closed her eyes, and felt her heart torn in two, one half trembling with the need to protect herself, to protect this fragile job and roof over her head, and the other half, the stubborn half she had never been able to smother, quietly reminding her that there was a woman lying in a hospital bed who had said she did not slip. Felicity didn't sleep that night. She put Walter to bed, sat watch beside him until the little boy drifted off, then returned to her small room in the servants' quarters, sat down on the edge of the bed in the dark, and let the weight of what she had just learned press down on her chest. She thought about her life, about how it had narrowed into such a fragile thread. 2 years earlier, her husband had died in an accident at the construction site where he worked, a fall from scaffolding that people called an occupational risk, and he had left her with only one thing, not money, not a house, but a stack of medical bills so high she didn't dare look directly at the number on the final line. His months in the hospital, the hopeless surgeries, the emergency calls in the middle of the night, all of it had turned into debt, and that debt followed her like a shadow, clinging to every paycheck, every dollar she managed to save. She had no parents to lean on. Her mother had died when she was still young, and her father had left so long ago that she could barely remember his face. She had no siblings, no relatives in this city, no savings she could call a safety net, no backup plan if she lost her job tomorrow. Her work in the Lombardi house was everything standing between her and the abyss, and she knew that with painful clarity, down to the last inch. But above the job, above the roof over her head and the wages she earned, there was Walter. She remembered the first day she held him, when he still couldn't walk, a motherless child in a house full of adults too busy or too cold to truly see him, and she remembered the way he had wrapped his tiny hand around her finger and refused to let go. She had loved that little boy with every empty place life had left inside her, loved him as though he were the child she had never had the chance to bring into the world, and she knew that love wasn't part of a maid's job description, but she couldn't stop it. She remembered the day she was interviewed 2 years ago, in the sun-filled kitchen, when that woman had set down her teacup and looked straight into her eyes, not asking about her experience or her letters of recommendation, but asking only one question, whether she was an honest person. And Felicity had said yes. She had said yes, and at that moment she had meant it. Now, sitting in the darkness with that sentence echoing in her mind, she understood that honesty had a price, and that price changed depending on how much a person had to lose. She thought about what would happen if she spoke, if she opened her mouth and said that the boss's 3-year-old son had witnessed Sable Voss doing what she had done, then what would come next? In 6 weeks, Sable would become Toby's wife, would become the mistress of this house, would hold the fate of every servant beneath this roof in her hands. A woman who had dared do that to her husband's own sister would not hesitate to throw out a maid who dared breathe a word, and that was only the gentlest possibility. She thought about darker possibilities she did not dare name, and she shuddered. But what hurt her most was not her own fate. It was Walter. If Sable became the mistress of the house, if she held full power here, then Felicity would be the first one pushed out the door, and the child she loved more than life itself would be left behind, alone in the arms of the very woman who had pushed his aunt down the stairs, growing up under the care of someone whose true face he had already seen. That thought stole her breath. She sat there for a long time, torn between two instincts equally strong, the instinct to survive pulling her back into silence and something deeper, harder, refusing to lie still, and when dawn began to slip through the window crack, she still had not dared to speak. She only knew that she could not stay silent forever. By the 3rd day, Felicity began to realize she was not the only one making calculations. Sable was calculating too, and she was far better at it. It began with things so small they were almost impossible to grasp. An idle remark dropped at breakfast, a slight frown when Felicity carried Walter through the foyer, a question that seemed harmless about how the boy was being watched. Then it grew. One afternoon, as Felicity passed Toby's study carrying clean towels upstairs, she heard Sable's voice drifting through the half-open door, gentle but deliberate, telling him that she was worried about Walter, that she had noticed the boy wandering alone lately in unsafe parts of the house, that a 3-year-old child drifting through the second-floor hallway without an adult watching him would sooner or later end in trouble, and that perhaps the maid looking after him had grown too careless, too busy with housework to remember her most important responsibility. She said perhaps it was time the family considered hiring a professional nanny, someone properly trained, someone they could trust completely, and that she would be happy to handle the search herself. Felicity stood frozen in the hallway, the stack of towels clutched tightly against her chest, and she understood at once what Sable was doing. This wasn't concern. This was a move on a board. Sable was trying to separate her from Walter, and separate Walter from the only person to whom he had told the truth. But it was Sable's next sentence that turned Felicity's spine cold. In a voice light as silk, almost teasing, she added that children that age were strange, that they wandered everywhere and saw all sorts of things they shouldn't see, then ran around telling people things they didn't understand, and that a child who spoke that way needed to be shaped carefully before it became a habit. Felicity had to put a hand against the wall to steady herself. She knows, or at least, she suspects. Sable Voss had guessed that the child had seen something, and now she was laying the foundation, brick by brick, for the day when anything Walter said would be dismissed as the wild invention of a badly behaved child, and for the day when the only person he trusted would be pushed out of his life. Felicity stepped back from the door very quietly, held the towels tighter, and climbed the stairs on trembling legs, understanding for the first time that the boy she loved was not only an accidental witness, but had become a target. That afternoon, they brought Delphine home from the hospital. Because she could not climb the stairs, Toby had a large room on the ground floor turned into a recovery room, arranging a private nurse, a physical therapy schedule, everything money could buy. Felicity was assigned to bring tea and change the bedsheets in that room, and it was on one such afternoon, while she was quietly adjusting the window curtains, that Delphine spoke from the bed. Her voice was weak, her face still bruised, one casted wrist resting across her body, but her eyes were frighteningly clear. She told Felicity softly, only loud enough for the two of them to hear, that she did not believe she had slipped. She said that in the moment before she fell, she had felt a force knock sideways against her cane, a clear push from the side, not the slip of someone losing her balance, and that she had tried to say it, but no one seemed to want to listen. Felicity kept her hand still on the fold of the curtain, did not turn around, did not say anything, trying to keep her breathing even. But Delphine was not a woman easily fooled. After a moment of silence, in the small but firm voice of someone who had already read the secret being hidden, she said she knew Felicity was hiding something. It was not a question. Felicity smoothed the curtain flat, her shoulders stiffening, and still did not answer. Sable did not let things drag on. The next morning, she made her move, and she chose the exact moment when Toby was sitting in the large parlor with his first coffee of the day, his face still heavy from sleepless nights. Felicity was there, dusting the bookshelf near the window, and Walter was playing on the rug in the middle of the room with his familiar wooden blocks, and that was why everything unfolded the way it did, though no one in the room could have seen it coming. Sable came in, sat down beside Toby, and began speaking in the gentle, worried voice she had been using for the past several days. She said she didn't want to burden him further at a time like this, but she felt it was her responsibility to speak. She brought up again the matter of Walter wandering around without anyone watching him, then skillfully guided the conversation toward something farther, something far more poisonous. She lowered her voice, making herself seem hesitant, then said she had thought a great deal about that afternoon, and that there was a possibility she had been afraid to say out loud, but could no longer keep inside. She said the maid, Felicity, had also been upstairs at around that same time, that she wondered whether, through carelessness or worse, that woman had bumped into Delphine, had done something that caused her to fall, and that perhaps because she feared losing her job, she had kept quiet. Sable said she didn't want to accuse anyone, but for the safety of the whole family, for Walter's own safety, perhaps it was time to let that maid go. Felicity stood frozen beside the bookshelf, the dust cloth in her hand falling silently to the floor, and she felt as though the whole world were collapsing around her. Toby turned to look at her, his eyes darkening, and in one terrible instant she saw on his face the cold calculation of a man deciding another person's fate, as though he were moving a piece on a board. She opened her mouth but could not make a sound, because she knew anything she said now would only sound like the defense of someone guilty. And then, in the silence stretched tight as a wire, a tiny voice rose from the middle of the rug. Walter lifted his head from the wooden blocks, looked straight at his father with clear eyes, and said it wasn't Miss Felicity. The whole room froze. The boy went on, clear and without the slightest hesitation, saying that Miss Sable was the one who pushed Miss Delphine, and he pointed toward the woman sitting beside his father, that tiny finger aimed straight at her, without a moment of uncertainty. For the next few seconds, no one in the room breathed. The coffee cup in Toby's hand stopped in midair. Felicity could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, and she saw it that briefest instant, the moment Sable Voss's perfect mask cracked. Only a split second, but it was real. The softness vanished from her face, her eyes widened and then immediately lowered, a small muscle in her jaw twitched, and the hand resting on her knee tightened until the knuckles turned white before she managed to pull that mask back into place. She let out a laugh, light and strained, then said, "Goodness, children were like that." They overheard adults talking and remembered everything wrong, that surely the boy had heard someone retell the story and become all confused. She reached out as if to stroke Walter's head, but the boy dodged away, and that said more than any words could have. Toby did not move. He did not look at Sable. He was looking at his son, and on his face was something Felicity had never seen in that man before, a complete stillness, as though every part of him had gathered itself around the task of processing the few words that had just come out of his 3-year-old child's mouth. Because he understood, even if he did not want to understand, that a child that age had no reason to lie, and even less reason to say something that worked against the very woman who was about to become his stepmother. He set the coffee cup down on the table very slowly, very gently, then stood, and in a voice so low and even it was frightening, he told everyone to leave the room. The nurse, the housekeeper, and the 2 servants standing near the door immediately withdrew. Sable rose as well, about to say something more, but he gave her only one look and she fell silent, then walked out with a posture that still tried to preserve its dignity. When the door closed, only Toby, his little son, and Felicity remained in the room. Felicity still standing motionless beside the bookshelf, not knowing whether she was about to be cleared or about to step into the worst moment of her life. In the room where only the 3 of them remained, Toby turned to Felicity and asked her in a low voice whether she knew what his son was talking about. Felicity stood there with her hands clasped tightly in front of her stomach, and she understood that the moment she had feared for the past several days had finally arrived, that there was nowhere left to retreat. She had rehearsed in her mind dozens of times how she would say this, had thought of ways to wrap it carefully, so it would be what Walter had seen and not an accusation from her, so it could not turn back against her. But when she opened her mouth, every word she had arranged fell apart, and what came out was much simpler. She said his son had been sitting and playing in the 2nd-floor hallway that afternoon. She said the little boy had told her what he saw, and that he had repeated it many times, exactly the same each time, without adding or leaving anything out, in the way a child speaks only when he is recounting something real rather than something he imagined. Then she told him, detail by detail, what Walter had said to her in the laundry room, about the cane, about the foot, about the way that woman had raised her hand to cover her mouth and pretended to be devastated without a single tear. She said everything, then fell silent and lowered her head to wait. The silence that followed was the longest silence of Felicity's entire life. It stretched so long that she could hear the clock ticking on the mantel, could hear Walter's soft breathing as he kept playing on the rug, completely unaware that the words he had just spoken had shaken the whole house. Toby said nothing for a very long time. He stood with his back to the window, the morning light falling across one side of his face, and Felicity could not read anything there. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the relief or gratitude she had secretly hoped for. It was cold, sharp, and full of suspicion. He asked her whether she understood what she had just said. He asked her whether she knew what it meant to accuse his fiancée of something like that. And then, with the instinct that had been forged in him through all those years of living in a world where every word could be a trap, he began to suspect her. He wondered whether this was someone else's move, whether some enemy had planted a person inside his house, using a maid and a child to sow distrust, to crack his family apart from within. Because in his world, people did things like that. He wondered whether she was after money, whether this was the beginning of an attempt at blackmail, whether the woman who quietly scrubbed his floors was truly as quiet as she appeared. He did not say all of those things out loud, but Felicity could read them in the way he looked at her, and she did not blame him, because she understood that a man like him could not survive by trusting easily. That night, Toby had people investigate her. He had people who did this work quickly and quietly, and within only a few hours they placed on his desk everything there was to know about Felicity Hale. He read it alone in his study under the yellow light, and what he read looked nothing like the portrait of a conspirator. He read about a woman widowed while still far too young, about a man who had died in a workplace accident, about a stack of medical bills so high it swallowed every dollar she earned. He read about someone with no mother or father, no siblings, no savings account, no relationship that could be used as leverage. He read about 2 years of her working in his house without a single complaint, without one absence, and between the dry lines of the report, he found something no file stated plainly, but that he could still feel, that this woman loved his son sincerely, in a way no one could pretend for 2 whole years. He closed the file and sat for a long time in the darkness. One part of him had begun to believe her, but belief alone wasn't enough. In his world, acting on words without proof was the fastest way to bring blood down on an entire family, and if he was wrong, if he moved against his fiancée because of the words of a child and a maid, the price would be beyond repair. He needed evidence. He needed to be certain. The next morning, Toby did something he had never done in the 3 years since Walter was born. He told Felicity to bring the boy to his study, then closed the door and sat down on the floor. The man whom all of Red Hook Harbor bowed their heads to when they passed, the man even the most stubborn men did not dare look straight in the eye, sat cross-legged on the thick rug in his own study, level with his 3-year-old son, who was clutching a gray stuffed rabbit with worn fur. He did not know how to begin. He had interrogated the hardest men, had read lies on the faces of seasoned adults, but sitting in front of his own child, he found himself strangely clumsy, unsure of his own hands. He asked Walter about that afternoon in the gentlest voice he could manage, and the boy, who rarely ever received such complete attention from his father, looked up at him with an expression that was both surprised and pleased, then began to tell him. He spoke without hesitation, without needing to be prompted, and when Toby asked what the woman had done to the cane, the boy set the stuffed rabbit down on the rug, stood up, and acted it out. He put one foot forward and flicked it sideways with the edge of his tiny foot, a clear motion across to the side, then said she had done that to the cane, and then Miss Delphine fell. Toby sat perfectly still, and a cold current ran down his spine, because that movement, that sideways flick, was far too specific for a 3-year-old child to invent. A child taught to lie, or a child merely imagining something, would say vague things, would say someone shoved her, someone pushed her from behind, the kind of general images a young mind could easily picture. But Walter did not describe a shove. He described a sideways force striking the point of support, a flick that took the cane's footing away before the person fell with it, and that was exactly the kind of movement no natural slip could create. Toby had seen enough in his life to understand the difference between an accident and a deliberate act, and his son, without knowing what he was doing, had just described a deliberate act to him. He thanked the boy, awkwardly patted his head, then called Felicity in to take him away, and he remained sitting alone on the floor for a long time, looking at the gray stuffed rabbit Walter had forgotten on the rug. That evening, at dinner, Toby did something else he had never done before. He watched Sable. Not the way a man looks at the woman he is about to marry, but the way he stares at an opponent across a negotiating table, examining every smallest gesture to find what was hidden behind it. And for the first time he noticed. He observed the way she asked about Delphine in exactly the right silences, the way she mentioned the wedding with a calmness that should not have existed in a house that had just endured such a crisis, the way every sentence she spoke fitted into the circumstances so smoothly that it almost left no opening. During the 2 years he had been with her, he had always taken that calmness as a valuable quality, the sign of a steady woman who never panicked, who never let emotion overrun reason. He had admired it. But tonight, watching her through the candlelight, he suddenly realized something that chilled him, that in all those 2 years he had never once seen her truly react. Not once had he seen her say something impulsive, speak out of turn, reveal an emotion before she could control it. Everything about her was measured, calculated, presented at exactly the right time and in exactly the right place. And he understood that what he had been calling composure all this time might in fact be something else entirely. It was calculation. He set down his glass of wine, smiled when she said something, nodded at the proper moment, and played his own role to completion. But beneath that surface, he had begun to hunt. Toby was not the kind of man who acted on feelings, even though his feelings were rarely wrong. He needed to know why. A sideways flick against his sister's cane was not the impulsive act of a passing burst of anger. It was deliberate, and every deliberate act had a motive behind it, and he was determined to find that motive. He called a man he used only for matters that required absolute discretion. A private investigator who had once worked in federal investigations before leaving to take jobs that paid better and asked fewer questions. He did not tell the man to investigate Sable. He told him to reconstruct the entire week before Delphine fell. Every meeting, every call, every notable movement in and around the house, because he knew that if there had been a scheme, it must have left a trace somewhere in the days leading up to the incident. It took 4 days for the investigator to bring him what Toby had sensed was out there. They met in an empty coffee shop in Brooklyn, where no one knew their faces, and the man placed a thin file on the table, thin but enough to change everything. 2 weeks before the fall, Delphine Lombardi had made a private appointment with the family's longtime attorney, a man named Abernathy, who had served the Lombardi family for nearly 30 years. The purpose of the appointment was not routine. Delphine had asked to review the entire structure of the family's legal asset fund, the clean portion of the fortune held beneath the shipping and logistics companies under the name Harbor Line, and she had proposed a fundamental change. She wanted to move most of that fortune into a transparent charitable trust, publicly supervised, dedicated to supporting widows and poor children in the city. It was a decision marked deeply by Delphine's character, the woman who had always been the family's conscience, the woman who had always wanted to cleanse money that had passed through too much darkness, and more importantly, that change was designed in a way that would tighten what Toby's future wife could ever hold. It would place most of the assets beyond the reach of anyone who entered the family through marriage, locking them inside a structure that no prenuptial agreement or divorce could touch. Delphine had not told Toby about this yet. She had meant to tell him once everything had been drafted and finalized, but she hadn't had time. And that was the crucial point. The investigator turned to the next page, and what Toby read there made his fingers tighten around the coffee cup. There was someone inside Abernathy's office, a young paralegal who handled drafting and records storage, and that assistant had been approached. For months before that, she had received small gifts, intimate lunches that never appeared in any records, from someone who, at first glance, had no reason at all to know a low-level employee in a law office. The investigator had traced those meetings, had reconstructed the connection someone had tried very hard to hide, and the conclusion appeared with chilling clarity. Sable Voss had known. She had known about the change to the asset fund before it was even completed, known that if Delphine stayed alive long enough to sign those documents, her financial position in this marriage would be entirely different from what she had calculated, dreamed of, and spent 2 whole years betting everything to obtain. She had known, and she had known the clock was counting down. Toby sat in the coffee shop for a long time after the investigator had left, the file open in front of him, the coffee gone cold in his hand. The final piece had just fitted into place, and the picture that emerged was so complete it made him feel sick. Not a slip, not an accident. A cold calculation with a clear motive, aimed at his sister to protect a fortune. He closed the file, left a few bills on the table, and stepped out into the cold gray afternoon. And for the first time since the night it happened, the anger inside him had taken a definite shape. Toby could have stopped there. He had a motive, he had a witness, he had enough to know what he needed to know. But there was something in the file that would not leave him at peace, a small detail the investigator had recorded, almost by chance. That the secret lunches with that paralegal had not always been handled by Sable alone. Sometimes there had been a man with her, a man the investigator had not yet identified, and it was that nameless shadow that kept Toby awake for one more night, because if Sable was acting alone, then she was only a greedy opportunist. But if there was a man behind her, then this was no longer about a fortune. This was a far larger conspiracy. He told the investigator to keep going, this time focusing on that unknown man, and what they found in the days that followed shook the very foundation of Toby's world. The man was not a stranger. He was Cyrus Vane. Cyrus Vane, his lieutenant, the man who had stood at his right hand for nearly 10 years, the man Toby had trusted with matters he trusted to no one else, the man who had walked with him through the longest nights and the hardest decisions, the man he had once regarded almost as a brother. He and Sable were not merely accomplices, they were lovers. That relationship had been hidden with perfect care, disguised beneath the appearance of professional courtesy. The time Cyrus came by the house, the polite conversations in front of Toby, all of it only a cover for something that had quietly grown beneath his own roof, right before his eyes, for all that time. And when the investigator fitted the pieces together one by one, their plan emerged with a cold cruelty that forced Toby to set the file down and pace the room several times just to hold back the nausea. The plan had not begun with the fall. It had been woven long before, patiently, step by step. Sable would marry him. She would become Toby Lombardi's lawful wife, and through that marriage she would gain an official place in the family, a legally recognized claim to inheritance, a position from which she could reach the wealth and power he held. Then, once everything had been made legal, once that title was securely in her hands, Toby would become unnecessary. They would remove him. The method could change. An accident, a betrayal at the right moment, a purge stage to blame some rival family. But the ending had already been decided, and after he was gone, Cyrus would step out of the shadows with the boss's widow beside him, and together they would seize the entire empire Toby had spent his life building and protecting. It was a perfect plan, cold and patient, and only two final obstacles stood in its way. The first obstacle was Delphine, the only person Toby truly loved without condition, a woman sharp enough to be dangerous, the one who had begun to sense something wrong in the woman about to enter her family. The second obstacle was the new will, the change in the asset fund Delphine was quietly preparing, the thing that would lock away everything they were reaching for if it was signed in time. And that was why the fall had to happen, and had to happen right then, before those documents were completed. Delphine was not the final target. She was only the first obstacle that had to be cleared from the path, one step in a longer, darker plan whose ending was Toby's own death. He stood by the window of his study, looking out over the black garden below, and the cold spreading through him was no longer anger, but something deeper, an absolute loneliness. The woman he had planned to marry wanted him dead. The brother he had trusted most wanted him dead. In the entire world he had built from power and fear, it turned out that the two people closest to him were the very two who had been silently counting down the final days of his life. And he suddenly realized, with a strange ache in his chest, that the only honest eyes left in this house belonged to a maid and a 3-year-old child. There was one question that would not leave Toby alone in the days that followed. A small question that kept gnawing at him from the inside. If this plan had been woven with such patience, if Cyrus and Sable had waited so long, then when had it all begun? Sable had entered his life about 2 years earlier, introduced at a party through connections that had seemed accidental, and she had been patient with his coldness. Warm in exactly the places he hadn't known were empty, until he had built an entire future around her without realizing he was doing it. But what if that meeting hadn't been accidental at all? He had the investigator trace things back even farther than the day Sable appeared, and what they found pushed him to the edge of something he had never allowed himself to feel. 3 years earlier, his wife had died. She had died giving birth to Walter, and for 3 years he had lived with the belief that it was a medical complication, a cruel but natural tragedy, one of those terrible things life sometimes simply brings down for no reason at all. He had buried her, had held his newborn son in his arms, and promised himself he would protect him, and he had closed his heart from that day on, blaming fate, blaming medicine, blaming his own body for having brought such misery into the world. But it wasn't fate. The investigator had dug deep into the old medical records, into the statements of the people who had been present, into details that no one had thought to examine again 3 years before, and a pattern emerged among the things that had seemed disconnected. A hand interfering where no hand should ever have been, an arrangement disguised so skillfully that for 3 years no one had suspected a thing, and that hand belonged to Cyrus Vane. Toby sat motionless when he reached that part, and for one long moment he couldn't breathe, because now, as he fitted the dates together, the whole of the past 3 years of his life appeared beneath a new light, horrifying and cold. Cyrus had cleared the path first. He had removed the woman standing between him and power, the wife Toby had loved, leaving behind a lonely widower, a man who had just lost the most precious thing in his life, and was holding a newborn child in numb arms. Then he had waited. About a year later, when Toby's wound had hardened enough for him to let someone else come close, at the very moment when he was most vulnerable, Cyrus had planted Sable, had arranged that seemingly fated meeting, had released her into Toby's life like a piece placed on exactly the right square. And Sable had played that game perfectly, patiently building his trust for nearly 2 years, so that now, with only 6 weeks left before the wedding, the game was almost at its final move. Everything he had once believed was healing, a second chance at having a family, turned out to be nothing more than a performance staged, on top of the ashes of a tragedy those very people had caused. Delphine's fall was not the beginning of this conspiracy. It was only the peak of a plan that had lasted 3 years, a conspiracy that had begun with Walter's mother's death, and was supposed to end with Toby's own. Toby set the file down on the desk, and he sat there in the darkness for a very long time, so long that the garden lights outside turned themselves off on their timer. Everything he had ever trusted had cracked apart. The wife he had mourned had been murdered. The brother he had trusted was the man who killed her. The woman he was about to marry was a pawn sent in to finish wiping him out. He had lived his whole life by the rule that he should trust no one, and it turned out he still hadn't been suspicious enough. He thought of Walter sleeping upstairs, the child who had never known that his mother's death was a crime. He thought of Felicity, the woman who had risked her job and her safety to tell a truth she could have swallowed down. And for the first time in many years, the coldest man in Red Hook lowered his head into his hands. But if Toby was hunting, then so was his enemy. Cyrus Vane could not have survived nearly 10 years beside a boss like Toby Lombardi, without the ability to smell danger before it had fully taken shape. He realized something had changed inside the house, a new caution in the way Toby looked at people, unexplained absences. A detective he had vaguely heard had been called in. And when he traced backward to find what could have caused his plan to leak, he reached the same conclusion Felicity had feared from the very beginning. There was a witness, a child had seen, and that child had spoken. Cyrus knew he could not move against Toby's son. That was a line even he understood could not be crossed, unless he wanted to turn the entire underworld into his enemy. But he could do the next best thing. He could neutralize the person who had brought the child's words into the light, and he could do it in a way that made the truth itself become a weapon turned backward. He went to a man he had kept in his pocket for a long time, a police inspector named Porter Quinn, a man who had sold his soul for thick envelopes years ago and was willing to do whatever it took to keep that money flowing. And they built something, an investigation. Not a real investigation, but the shell of one. Enough paperwork, enough procedure, enough official appearance to wrap itself in legality. Quinn began quietly gathering what he called evidence, molded statements, twisted timelines, all pointing in one direction, that a maid named Felicity Hale had been upstairs at the time it happened, that she herself, in some moment, had injured Delphine Lombardi, either deliberately or through carelessness, and that she had hidden it. They reversed the entire truth, turned it upside down like flipping over a card, making the witness into the suspect, making the only person who had told the truth into the only person being accused. And Sable played her part perfectly. She went to Toby, carrying the news of the investigation as though it were a sad truth she was forced to report, and she urged him to act. She said the police were taking an interest in the matter, that if the family sheltered someone under suspicion, they would bring trouble onto themselves, that the wisest and cleanest thing to do was to turn Felicity over to the authorities and let the law do its work. She said all of it in a voice full of reason, full of concern for the family, and if this had been 1 week earlier, perhaps Toby would have listened, would have removed the maid from his life as easily as pushing aside an inconvenient problem. But this was not 1 week earlier. Toby sat and listened to her speak, his face revealing nothing, and in his mind were not Sable's words, but the image of his 3-year-old son standing in the middle of the rug, pointing with his tiny finger, and speaking a truth no child that age could have invented. He thought about the way Walter had dodged this woman's hand. He thought about the file locked in the drawer of his desk, and he understood exactly what this investigation was, understood who had built it and why, understood that handing Felicity over out there would not be giving her to justice, but throwing her into the mouths of the people who wanted to silence her forever. He looked at Sable, nodded slowly, and said he would consider it, that he needed time to handle everything the right way. But the moment she left the room, he called in his most trusted housekeeper and gave a brief order that Felicity Hale was not to leave the grounds of this house, not to imprison her, but to protect her, and that no one, not the police, not even Sable, was allowed near her without going through first. He had not told anyone that he had chosen a side. He had not even told Felicity herself. But in the moment he gave that order, he knew he had crossed a line from which there was no return. The crisis came at midnight, when the entire house was stretched tight as a thread about to snap. Walter, who had mild asthma that was usually well controlled, began having trouble breathing that night. The tension of the past few days, the suffocating air inside the house, perhaps even a child's instinctive sense that something was wrong, something he could not name, all of it gathered together. And by late night the boy's breathing had become quick and wheezing, each breath in a struggle. Felicity, who slept in the room next door and always kept her door slightly open, woke the instant she heard that sound. She rushed in, lifted the boy up, helped him sit upright so he could breathe more easily, and reached for the box holding the inhaler she always kept ready on the shelf. But when she shook it, the inhaler felt weightless. It was empty. She had made a note to buy more days ago, but amid the storm of everything that had happened, amid fear and torment, she had forgotten, and now in her hand was an empty inhaler and a child fighting for every breath. In that moment, a cold panic rose inside her, but she did not let it drown her. She had sat beside her husband's sick bed through too many nights to know that panic saved no one. She placed Walter on her lap, kept his back straight, threw the window wide open to let the cool air in, and spoke to him in the gentlest, steadiest voice she had, telling him to look into her eyes, to breathe with her, slowly, gently, while her own heart beat like a war drum. Then she did the only thing left to do. She ran to find the one person who could help, and in that vast house, the only person she thought of, the only person she trusted to place the child's life above every calculation, was Toby. She knocked on his door, then pounded on it, calling his name, and when he opened it with sleep, still heavy on his face, she only managed to say that Walter could not breathe and the medicine was gone. Toby did not ask another question. The man who usually weighed everything down to the second, who calculated every move, acted that night before he even had time to think. He rushed after her to the child's room, swept his son into his arms, pressed him against his chest, and ran down the stairs, across the foyer, and straight out to the car parked in front of the house. He did not call for a driver, did not wait for anyone, but got behind the wheel himself, with Walter and Felicity's arms in the back seat, and sped through the night toward the nearest hospital, one hand on the wheel, the other reaching back now and then, as if to make sure his son was still there. On the way out, they passed Sable. She was standing at the end of the hallway in a nightrobe, awakened by the noise, and she watched the scene, the child struggling to breathe, the father frantic, the maid with tears streaming down her face, with not even a ripple of emotion in her eyes. She did not step forward. She did not ask how she could help. She only stood there, arms folded over her chest, watching with the cold composure of someone looking at a problem that had nothing to do with her. And Toby, even in the panic of a father, still saw it. He saw the woman he had once planned to marry standing still as stone while his son fought for breath, and he saw the maid he had once considered pushing away holding the child tightly, whispering into his ear, putting her whole heart into keeping him calm. That contrast carved itself into him more deeply than any file ever could. At the hospital, the doctors intervened in time, and before too long, Walter's breathing became steady again, his small chest rising and falling peacefully in sleep, his tiny hand still gripping one of Felicity's fingers even after he had drifted off. Toby stood beside his son's bed, looking at the young woman bent over the child, her hair falling loose over one side of her face, still not leaving him by even half a step, and something inside his chest, something that had been frozen for 3 years since the day he lost his wife, began to crack. He said nothing. He only pulled a chair closer, sat down beside her, and for the first time in a long while he did not feel alone. 2 days after the night at the hospital, Toby went to Delphine's recovery room with the file in his hand, intending to tell his sister everything he had found. But when he stepped inside and closed the door, it was Delphine who spoke first, and what she said made him sit down. She told him not to rush, that she knew more than he thought, and that it was time he heard her side of the story. She began with the moment on the stairs. She said that at the time she hadn't been acting. The fall was real, the pain was real, the confusion was real, and when she opened her eyes, looked up into his face, and said she hadn't slipped. That was all she knew for certain inside, a head still spinning from the concussion, an instinctive feeling that some force had struck her cane from the side, though she hadn't yet understood who had done it or why. Then she lost consciousness, and in the first days at the hospital she truly was weak, truly in pain, truly only a woman, struggling to recover from a serious injury. But when her body began to improve, when her mind began to clear again, the suspicion inside her grew as well. She remembered where Sable had been standing in that moment, remembered the strange calmness she showed afterward, remembered the way the story of the accident was repeated again and again, with a smoothness that became suspicious, and she understood that if she continued to appear alert and doubtful, the person who had done it would know, and would act again, perhaps more decisively the next time. So she did something only someone like Delphine would have the courage to do. She chose to keep appearing weaker than she really was. She let Sable and the entire house believe that her mind was still foggy from the concussion, that she did not clearly remember what had happened, that she was a confused victim who could easily be convinced she had imagined everything. She had let Sable bring flowers to her room twice a day and speak sweet words, had weakly nodded along to the version of the accident Sable offered, had played the role of a frail, pitiful old woman so her enemy would lower her guard, and while playing that role, she had quietly gone to work. She had contacted Abernathy, the attorney who had served the family for nearly 30 years, and was one of the very few people in the world she trusted completely, and together with him, from her hospital bed, she had begun pulling each thread of this spiderweb into the light. She told Toby that she herself had discovered the leak inside the law office, that she had suspected the paralegal from the moment she realized someone knew about the changes to the asset fund that no one should have known, and that Abernathy was quietly following the financial trail, the payments, the meetings, to build the evidence from the inside. Toby sat and listened to his sister, and a feeling of both astonishment and sorrow rose inside him. All these days, he had thought he was fighting to protect Delphine, that she was the fragile one who needed him to shield her, that he was the only one standing between her and the people who wanted to hurt her. But it turned out that while he had been hunting in his own way, his sister had been hunting in hers, from a hospital bed, with a casted arm and a fractured hip, using the sharp intelligence and iron will that life had never managed to break. She was not a victim waiting to be rescued. She was someone who had chosen to turn her own injury into the trap. She looked at him and said she had kept silent with him for so long, not because she did not trust him, but because she knew his nature, knew that if he grew angry too soon, he would alert the enemy before they had enough evidence to bring them down completely. She needed time. She needed to let the spiders weave more of their own web. And now, when he had found one half of the truth on his own, and she was holding the other half, it was time for the two of them to put the pieces together. Toby looked at his sister for a long time, then placed his file on the bedside table, right beside the stack of papers she had hidden beneath her pillow, and for the first time in many days, he smiled faintly. That night, for the first time since the incident, 3 people sat together in Delphine's recovery room after the whole house had gone to sleep, and they spread everything they had across the table. Abernathy came in through the back entrance. An elderly man with silver hair and eyes that were still sharp after nearly 30 years of keeping this family's secrets, and he carried a leather briefcase filled with the things he and Delphine had quietly gathered. When the tall lines of investigation, Toby's moving from the outside in and Delphine's moving from the inside out, were finally joined together, the picture that appeared was complete and impossible to deny. The first piece was the cane. Delphine had asked to keep it instead of letting anyone throw it away, and Abernathy had quietly had a specialist examine it. On the lower shaft of the cane, there was a scratch, a clear scrape running sideways, and its position and direction did not match a natural fall at all. A person losing balance and falling forward would leave marks running vertically, in the direction of the foot slipping and the body's weight falling. But this scratch ran horizontally, exactly the kind left by a force striking from the side, a flick against the cane's point of support, precisely like the motion Walter had acted out on the rug in Toby's study. The physical evidence matched the words of a 3-year-old child with frightening precision. The second piece came from outside the Lombardi house walls. Toby had arranged for someone to access the security system of the neighboring estate, a broad mansion whose surveillance cameras covered part of the shared boundary. That camera could not see inside the staircase, but it did catch the large second-floor window of the Lombardi house, and with it a timestamp. In the footage they saw a figure, a shape and hair that could not be mistaken for anyone but Sable, moving away from the area near the stair landing, and what made the whole room fall silent as they watched was the rhythm of that shadow. She was not panicked, she was not running. She walked away slowly, calmly, with the posture of someone who had just completed something planned in advance, and it was not until about 20 seconds after that moment that the sound of the fall was recorded. 20 seconds. Not the immediate reaction of someone who had helplessly witnessed an accident, but the calculated withdrawal of someone who knew exactly what was about to happen. The third piece was money. This was the part Abernathy and Delphine had worked hardest on, following the hidden currents other people had believed were safely buried. There were transfers, disguised through several layers of intermediary accounts, but still leaving traces in the end, moving from Sable to the paralegal in Abernathy's office during the exact periods when information about the asset fund had leaked. And there was another flow of money, larger and more secretive, moving from Cyrus Vane to an account whose owner Abernathy had spent great effort tracing. And that owner was Inspector Porter Quinn, the man building the false investigation against Felicity. When Quinn's name appeared in the statements, everything closed into a perfect circle. The leak from the law office, the flick on the stairs, the calm retreat before the camera, the money used to buy a legal assistant, and a dirty police officer, all of it led back to the same two people, Sable Voss and Cyrus Vane. The two people standing closest to Toby, the two people who had quietly woven his death and his sister's death into the very days he had believed were peaceful. The three of them sat around the table lamp, looking down at everything spread before them, and a heavy silence settled over the room, no longer the silence of doubt, but the silence of certainty. Toby finally spoke, his voice low and cold as steel, saying they had enough. Enough to leave no opening for denial, enough to force Sable to face her own truth, and enough to drive Cyrus Vane into the very corner he had thought he was pushing others into. Delphine looked at her brother and asked how he planned to do it. Toby closed the file, and he said he would do it in the only way people like them understood. He would call all of them into the same room, but Cyrus Vane sensed the noose tightening around his neck before it could fully close. A man who had lived his whole life in the dark could always smell the end before it arrived, and he knew, through quiet clues that had leaked back to him, that Toby was no longer the blindfolded man he had been 2 weeks earlier. That files were being gathered, that the road Cyrus had patiently built for 3 years was beginning to collapse beneath his own feet, and when a man like Cyrus was backed into a corner, he did not beg. He looked for a weakness. He had known Toby Lombardi for nearly 10 years, had seen the man coldly make decisions no one else dared make, had watched him face enemies without so much as blinking, and he understood that inside that whole iron-built man, there was only one soft place, one point that, if pressed, would make even the boss stop. It was his son. One afternoon, while Toby was in his study, his phone alerted him to a message from an unfamiliar number. There was no direct threat, not a single word that could be used as evidence in court, only a photograph and one short line. The photograph showed the front yard of a playground, where Walter was sometimes taken from a distance, and the line beneath it merely said that children were fragile, that accidents could happen to anyone, anywhere, and that there were things a wise father should leave alone instead of stirring up. Toby read it, and for one moment, the whole world around him seemed to freeze solid. This was the message Cyrus meant to send. Step back. Bury what you've found. Let everything pass, or the price will be the only precious thing you have left in this world. Rage rose in Toby so violently that he had to set the phone down and stand still for a long while so he would not smash something. But he was not a man who let emotion control his actions, and the very coldness people had always feared in him now became his salvation. He did not panic, he acted. He called Felicity into the room, and for the first time he spoke to her, not in the voice of an employer, but in the voice of a frightened father, telling her just enough for her to understand that Walter was in someone's sights, that there were people willing to use the child as a card to force him into silence. Felicity listened, and she did not cry, did not collapse, though her heart felt as if it were being crushed. Instead, she straightened, and in her eyes was something Toby recognized immediately, because it was exactly like the thing burning inside him, an iron resolve that nothing would be allowed to touch the boy. That night, the two of them made a plan together. Toby chose 3 men from among the subordinates he trusted absolutely, men who had proven their loyalty over many years, and had no link at all to Cyrus, and he arranged to move Walter out of the mansion to a discreet safe house in the suburbs, a place whose address no one knew except him and Felicity. Felicity went with the boy because no one could have convinced her to leave him at a time like this, and also because Toby understood that the only person who could keep Walter calm through all this upheaval was her. He saw them to the car in the darkness before dawn, and when Felicity climbed in carrying the sleeping Walter, Toby placed one hand on her shoulder, and in that brief moment, no words were spoken, yet both of them understood. They were no longer employer and maid. They had become 2 people standing on the same side, protecting something more precious than their own lives. He watched the car disappear beyond the gate, then turned back into the house, now empty and cold, and he knew it was time to end everything. Cyrus had made his final mistake. He had pointed the knife toward the child, and by doing so, he had taken away the last trace of hesitation Toby had left. The confrontation took place 2 days later, on the highest floor of the Harborline building, overlooking the cold gray water of Red Hook Harbor. Toby had chosen this place deliberately, a spacious conference room with glass walls, a place that belonged to him down to the last inch, where no one could enter or leave without passing through his people. He summoned Sable with the excuse of discussing the wedding, and summoned Cyrus with the excuse of a routine business meeting, and both of them walked in without knowing the other would be there, without knowing this room had already been prepared like a closed trap. When the door shut behind them, they saw the others already waiting. Abernathy sat at one end of the table with his familiar leather briefcase. Felicity stood quietly by the wall, present because Toby had asked her to be there after Walter had been secured under guard. And at the other end of the room, seated in a wheelchair, was Delphine, her back straight, her sharp eyes carrying no trace of the confusion she had pretended to have for so many days. Sable saw her, and for one moment the smile on her lips hardened. Toby wasted no time. He began laying out the evidence, layer by layer, slowly and coldly, like a man turning over cards he already held securely in his hand. He placed on the table the image taken from the neighbor's camera, the calm shadow walking away 20 seconds before the sound of the fall. He set down the examination report on the cane, with its horizontal scratch that could not be explained by a slip. He placed down the transfer statements from Sable to the paralegal, and then, looking directly at Cyrus for the first time, he laid down the money trail from his lieutenant to Inspector Porter Quinn. Each sheet of paper touching the tabletop was another wall in their castle of lies collapsing. Sable managed to keep her composure until the final document, and then she could not hold it anymore. Her collapse was not loud, not dramatic, but simply exhausted, as though the effort of keeping the mask intact for 2 years had finally run out. She looked at Delphine, then at Toby, and in a voice so small it was almost meant only for herself. She said Delphine was going to ruin everything, that the new will would take everything away, that she had done what had to be done. Toby asked her what she had hoped to gain from all of this, and Sable lifted her eyes to him, and for the first time there was no performance left covering her face. She said she had only wanted to be safe. That was all. All her life she had been running towards safety, and she had thought she was finally close enough to touch it. For one strange moment, Toby almost felt something like pity. But that was when Cyrus, who had been silent from the beginning, understood that there was no way out left, and he drew a gun. Everything happened very quickly. Toby's men, already positioned around the room, moved in at once, but in that burst of chaos, a shot rang out, deafening in the enclosed space, and the bullet struck the glass wall right beside where Felicity stood, missing her by only a breath. And Toby, without a second of hesitation, lunged forward. He crossed the entire room and covered her with his own body, turning his back toward the danger, wrapping her fully in his arms to shield her. And in that moment, when he placed his body between this woman and a bullet, every question that remained in his heart vanished. His men forced Cyrus down to the floor, disarmed him, and pinned him there, and the noise faded into a heavy silence broken only by ragged breathing. Toby slowly released Felicity, looking into her eyes to make sure she was unharmed, and she looked back at him, trembling but whole. Around them, the empire of lies had completely collapsed. Sable sat slumped in her chair with nothing left to perform. Cyrus was held down on the floor, his eyes still burning with hatred, but with no path left to take. And Toby Lombardi stood in the middle of the room, one hand still resting on the shoulder of the woman he had just shielded with his own body, and knew the war was over. What happened to Cyrus Vane after that night unfolded according to rules that were not written down anywhere, but were obeyed more strictly than any law in any book. In the world Toby and Cyrus both belonged to, betrayal from within was the gravest offense, and a man who had plotted to murder his own boss, who had laid a hand on the blood of the family, was not a matter people settled with police or courts. Toby did not act by his own hand. He did what tradition demanded. He brought Cyrus before a council made up of the heads of the other families, presented all the evidence, and let the very world Cyrus had lived and schemed inside pass judgment on him. There is no need to describe in detail what came for him behind that closed door. It is enough to know that Cyrus Vane disappeared from Red Hook, from every board of power, from every story people still dared to tell, and that from then on, his name was mentioned only as a chilling reminder of what waited for traitors. The council had spoken and its judgment was absolute. With Porter Quinn, it was different. Quinn was a police officer, and even as a dirty police officer, he still belonged to the world of the law. And Toby understood that the most fitting punishment for a man who had betrayed his badge was to let the very system he had sold swallow him whole. Abernathy, with nearly 30 years of experience moving through the fragile borders of the law, quietly gathered all the evidence of the dirty money, the false investigation Quinn had built, and the statements he had shaped, then packaged it all into a clean, legal, undeniable file. Then he sent it through discreet and secure channels to the Federal Internal Investigation Division, the people who were always eager to find rot inside their own ranks. Quinn was investigated, stripped of his badge, and made to face the very machinery of justice he had once believed he could buy outright. He would pay not by the law of the shadows, but by the very law he had betrayed, and there was a justice of its own in that. But with Sable Voss, Toby faced a far more difficult choice. By the rules of his world, she deserved the same fate as Cyrus, perhaps even more, because she had laid her hands on his sister. His men waited for the order, and one nod from him would have been enough for Sable Voss to disappear as though she had never existed. He stood before that decision for a long time, and in the end he chose another path, not out of mercy, but because he had understood what truly frightened this woman most. He remembered what she had said in the conference room, that all her life she had only wanted to be safe, and he realized that death, for someone like Sable, would almost be a release, a door closing quickly and cleanly. What she feared was not death. What she feared was uncertainty, the feeling of having nothing left to cling to, of having to live inside an unease that never ended. So he gave her exactly that fear. He stripped her of everything, every dollar, every connection, every support she had spent her whole life gathering. And then he did something even heavier. He let the entire underworld know who Sable Voss was and what she had done, sent her name through every family, every corner, with a clear message that this woman was not to be protected by anyone, was not to be allowed to find shelter anywhere. He pushed her out into the world alone, empty-handed, carrying a name that had become a curse. So she would live the rest of her life inside the very insecurity she had spent all her life trying to escape. When he watched her walk out the door for the last time, her posture still trying to remain straight but her eyes already hollow, Toby felt something pass through him that almost resembled pity. He understood, in some cold corner of his heart, that this woman had been shaped by a fear perhaps older than all her schemes. but that understanding did not erase what she had done. It did not give Walter back the mother she and Cyrus had stolen from him. It did not erase the bruise on Delphine's temple. He allowed that pity to exist for one moment, then he turned away, and he did not look back. 3 weeks later, Delphine Lombardi walked across the grand foyer of the mansion on her own, slowly with her cane, and she had refused the doctor's advice that she should rest a while longer. That was the kind of woman she was, someone who would not allow life or anyone else to decide for her what she could and couldn't do. Walter was sitting on the foyer floor, in the same place and the same posture where he often sat, his wooden blocks arranged into something only he understood, and Delphine stopped in front of him. She bent down until she was level with those clear eyes, and thanked him with the solemn respect one would give an adult, thanking him for speaking the truth when even the adults in the house had chosen silence. Walter looked up at her with the innocent seriousness of a child who had not yet learned that telling the truth could be complicated, and he simply replied that he had only told what he saw, then turned back to his wooden blocks as though it were nothing important. And that was the most beautiful thing of all. In a house full of experienced, sharp, powerful people who knew how to hide things, the one who had seen the truth most clearly was a 3-year-old child who did not know how to pretend. And the one who had brought that truth into the light with all her courage was the most invisible woman in the house, a widowed maid no one had ever bothered to truly see. Toby learned something that a lifetime spent among power and fear had never taught him, that a person's worth does not lie in the status they carry, the wealth they possess, or where they stand in a room, but in the honesty and kindness they choose to keep even when it costs them. Dignity is not divided by wealth or poverty, and the clearest eyes sometimes belong to the person standing in the darkest corner. To honor Delphine's wish completely, the family brought to life the charitable foundation she had quietly prepared, a center devoted to helping widows and children in need throughout the city, the very people life so often turns away from. And Toby, not as payment but for a reason far simpler, erased the medical debt that had weighed on Felicity for 2 years, and arranged a complete treatment plan for Walter so the boy would never again have to endure a night of struggling for breath like that one. When Felicity tried to refuse, he said only one thing, that his son had trusted her, and for the first time in his life, he understood why. A few months later, on the day the center opened, sunlight spilled warmly across the steps, and among the crowd, Toby stood beside Felicity, while Walter was far more interested in his bunch of colorful balloons than in any of the speeches. Delphine held the little boy's hand and smiled for the camera in a way she rarely allowed herself to do. And then, in the middle of that moment, Walter looked up at Felicity, tugged at her sleeve the way he always did when something mattered, and called her Mommy. He said it naturally, without the slightest hesitation, as though it were the most obvious thing in the world. Felicity went still, tears shining in her eyes, and she looked at Toby, not knowing how he would respond. But Toby did not correct his son. He only looked at her with eyes that were no longer cold, and gently took her hand, the calloused hand that had scrubbed his floors for 2 years, the hand that had held his son tight on the night of the crisis, and he did not let go. The man who had spent his whole life trusting no one finally learned how to let another person in, and the woman who had spent her whole life learning how to become invisible was finally seen, cherished, and loved. From the broken pieces of loss and betrayal, a family had been put together again. Not perfect, but real. What lingers in the heart about this story is not the betrayal, because betrayal can be found anywhere, but the way the truth finally came forward, not from cameras, not from detectives, not from power or money, but from a child sitting on the floor, stacking blocks. A child who had not yet learned to be afraid of telling the truth. And perhaps the deepest lesson life leaves us is to listen to the people we are used to overlooking, to treasure honesty no matter where it comes from, and to remember that kindness and truth always carry a quiet strength that no conspiracy can defeat. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share it so we can listen together to many more moving stories every day. How do you feel about this story? Which character moved you the most? Please leave a comment so we can hear the feelings from deep within your heart. May everyone watching this video always have good health, a joyful life, and peace every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next videos.